I found the envelope wedged behind a baseboard I'd pried loose. Dust-coated, yellowed, never opened. My name was on it in handwriting I'd recognize anywhere, even after 47 years. I'd been packing boxes for 3 weeks, preparing to leave the apartment I'd lived in since 1979. My knees weren't what they used to be, and the landlord had mentioned selling the building. It seemed like time. The baseboard had come loose years ago. I'd meant to fix it, but never did. When I finally pulled it free, the envelope tumbled out like it had been holding its breath. The handwriting stopped me cold. I sat down on the bare floor, the envelope resting in my lap. My hands didn't shake. They just felt heavy, like they knew something I didn't yet. His name wasn't on the return address. It didn't need to be. I thought about James every few years, usually in autumn when the light slanted through windows the way it used to in his kitchen. We were 23 when we met, 24 when everything ended. I'd loved him in the way you love someone before you know love isn't always enough. He'd left Chicago in the spring of 1978, 3 weeks before we were supposed to move in together. No phone call, no letter, just his landlord telling me he'd cleared out overnight. I remembered standing in that hallway, holding the key he'd given me 2 months earlier. The landlord had looked uncomfortable, like he wished he didn't have to be the one telling me. I'd gone to James's apartment anyway. The door was unlocked. Inside, everything was gone except a coffee mug in the sink and a single coat hanger in the closet. I'd stood in the middle of that empty room for 20 minutes, trying to understand what I'd done wrong. For years, I convinced myself I'd done something wrong. The envelope felt lighter than I expected. I turned it over slowly. The seal had yellowed but never broken. It had been here the whole time. I thought about all the years I'd walked past that loose baseboard. I'd vacuumed around it, set boxes against it, painted the wall above it twice. And the whole time, his words had been waiting just inches away. I slid my finger under the flap. The paper tore unevenly, and I felt a small rush of air escape, like the letter had been waiting to breathe. What I read next made the walls of that empty apartment feel suddenly small. The letter was dated April 2nd, 1978, 3 days before he left. His handwriting was rushed in places, careful in others. He wrote the way he used to talk, thoughtful, searching for the right words, even when they didn't come easily. He told me he'd been diagnosed 6 months earlier. The doctors had given him a year, maybe less. He wrote that he didn't want me to watch him disappear. He said he loved me too much to let me carry that. I read the line again, then a third time. The letter explained that he'd wanted to tell me 100 times. He'd started to, once, on a walk along the lake. But every time he got close, he saw the future I deserved, the one he couldn't give me. So he made the choice for both of us. I remembered that walk. It had been a Saturday in March, unseasonably warm. We'd stopped near the water, and he'd gone quiet for a long time. I'd asked if something was wrong, and he'd smiled, but it hadn't reached his eyes. He'd said he was just thinking. I'd let it go. I didn't know then that the reason he left had nothing to do with me. He wrote that he was going back to Oregon, where his sister lived. He wanted to be near family for what came next. He said he hoped I'd be angry at first, then move on. He hoped I'd find someone who could stay. The last paragraph was shorter. He said he'd left the letter with his landlord, with instructions to slip it under my door after he was gone. But the landlord had moved unexpectedly, and I'd never received it. James wrote that he knew I'd wonder why. He said he was sorry for that. But he believed, even then, that wondering was better than watching. I set the letter down beside me on the floor. The apartment was so quiet I could hear my own breath. For 47 years, I'd believed I wasn't enough. I thought about the years after he left. I'd gone on a few dates, but nothing stuck. I told myself I was fine alone. I built a life around my work, my routines, my small corner of the city. There had been a man named Robert in 1983. He'd been kind, steady, the type of person everyone said would be good for me. We dated for 6 months before he'd asked me to move in with him. I'd said no. I told him I wasn't ready, but the truth was I didn't trust it. I kept waiting for him to leave the way James had. Robert had been patient at first, but eventually he'd moved on. I'd watched him marry someone else 2 years later and told myself I'd made the right choice. But I'd always carried the feeling that I'd failed somehow, that if I'd been different, he would have stayed. The date on the letter told me something I'd never considered. He hadn't lived long after leaving. I didn't know that for certain, but the timeline felt clear. If he'd had a year, maybe less, he would have been gone by 1979. I'd spent decades blaming myself for something that was never mine to carry. The light in the room had shifted. It was late afternoon now, the kind of golden hour that used to make James stop mid-sentence just to look out the window. I picked up the letter again. This time, I noticed a line I'd skimmed before. "You deserved a whole life, Linda. I couldn't give you that, but I could give you the chance." I felt something crack open inside me. Not painfully, just softly, like a door I'd kept locked without realizing it. He'd thought he was protecting me. And maybe, in his own broken way, he had been. But he'd also left me with a question I'd carried alone all these years. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just sat there, holding it, feeling the weight of all the years it had been waiting. The sun had dipped lower. The room was filled with that particular kind of quiet that comes just before evening. I thought about calling someone, my sister, maybe. But I didn't know how to explain what I was feeling. It wasn't grief exactly. It wasn't relief either. It was something softer, something like understanding. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. The movers were coming in 2 days. I'd already decided to downsize, to find something smaller and easier to manage, a place with better light, maybe near the park. But now, holding that letter, I realized something else. I'd been shrinking my life for years without noticing. I'd told myself it was practical, sensible. But really, I'd been living carefully, like I didn't deserve to take up space. James had wanted me to have a whole life. I wasn't sure what that meant anymore, but I knew it didn't look like this. Only in that moment did I realize I'd been waiting for permission I already had. I thought about the women's book club I'd been invited to join last year. I'd said no because it felt indulgent. I thought about the art class at the community center I'd walked past 100 times. I thought about my neighbor, Margaret, who'd mentioned needing help organizing a fundraiser for the local food bank. I'd told her I didn't have time, but the truth was I'd been afraid of getting too involved, too visible. For so long, I'd believed I didn't deserve more than I already had. But James's letter hadn't been an apology. It had been a gift. A messy, painful, 47 years too late gift, but a gift nonetheless. He'd chosen to leave so I could stay, and I had stayed. I'd stayed in this city, in this life, in this quiet little corner I'd carved out for myself. But staying didn't mean I had to stay small. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting just a little. I set the letter on top of the nearest box and looked around the empty apartment one last time. The walls were bare. The rooms echoed. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of what I'd lost. I felt the softness of what I'd been given. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the small ways I'd made myself smaller over the years, the invitations I'd declined, the conversations I'd kept short, the dreams I'd told myself were impractical. I got up around 2 in the morning and made tea. The kitchen was mostly packed, but I found a mug in the back of a cabinet, the blue one with the chipped handle that I'd been meaning to throw away for years. I sat at the table and watched the steam rise. Somewhere in Oregon, James had spent his last months believing he'd done the right thing. And maybe he had. Maybe there was no other way it could have gone. But sitting there in the dark, holding that chipped mug, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't spend the rest of my life wondering what I could have been. 2 weeks later, I moved into a smaller place near Lincoln Park. The light was better, just like I'd hoped. I could see the trees from my window, and on clear mornings, I could hear the faint hum of the city waking up. The first morning in the new apartment, I unpacked slowly. I'd brought less than I expected. Most of the furniture from the old place had felt too heavy, too tied to a version of myself I didn't want to carry forward. I set the blue mug on the kitchen counter. I hung a small mirror in the hallway. I placed the wooden box with James's letter on my nightstand. Then I stood in the middle of the living room and just breathed. The walls were cream-colored. The floors were hardwood, worn smooth in places. The windows let in so much light I had to squint. It felt like starting over. And for the first time, that didn't scare me. I joined the book club the following Tuesday. We met in a cafe on Armitage, and I almost turned around twice before I walked in. But I didn't. The women were warm, welcoming in a way that didn't feel forced. We talked about the book for an hour, then drifted into other things. Travel, grandchildren, a recipe someone's mother used to make. One woman, Catherine, mentioned she'd just started taking pottery classes. She said her hands shook a little now, but she liked the feel of the clay. I thought about that all the way home. I signed up for the art class the next week. It was watercolor, something I'd never tried before. The instructor was younger than me, patient and encouraging. I painted a tree. It looked nothing like a tree, but I didn't care. I helped Margaret with the fundraiser in late October. We organized a bake sale and a small auction. I baked 3 dozen cookies and spent an afternoon arranging tables in the church basement. Margaret hugged me when we counted the donations at the end of the day. We'd raised twice what we'd planned. She said we made a good team. I told her we should do it again next year, and I meant it. I didn't talk about the letter much. It felt private, like something I wanted to hold close for a while longer. But I thought about it often, especially on the mornings when I'd wake up and feel that old ache, the one that used to whisper I wasn't enough. Now, when that ache showed up, I'd think about James's last line. "You deserved a whole life, Linda." He'd been right. I did. And for the first time, I was ready to live it. The envelope still sits on my nightstand, tucked inside the small wooden box my mother gave me years ago. I don't open it often, but I like knowing it's there. Some memories don't need to be revisited to matter. They just need to be remembered, gently, honestly, without the weight of all the years we spent misunderstanding them. James had loved me enough to let me go. It took me 47 years to understand that. But now that I did, I wasn't going to waste another day wishing I'd known sooner. I had a whole life ahead of me, and I was finally ready to see where it could go. Would you open a letter like this after so many years?